Oracle of the Forgotten, the Wandering Swordsman, the last step into darkness. As they stepped out of the portal, Odilon and Nalia found themselves in a strange landscape. The soft purple grasses reached towards a sky filled with stars and planets. The flowers seemed to glow slightly as the pair passed. After walking in the sheer darkness, this was almost a comfort. Still, the two had places to be. It took time to reach the lands of gluttony, but they knew the fastest way to navigate the realms was with the permission of one of the presiding lords. Both had fought quite often along the way, easily taking down their enemies. The few wounds the mortal received seemed to close on their own. While painful, the armor was doing its job to keep him alive. Nalia had not gone back to using a spear. By this point, she had taken to using 2 blades, one in each hand. She had always been better with a blade. It was her own arrogance that left her using a spear instead. She had always felt she was giving them too much disadvantage using a weapon she was clearly superior with. If anything, she was embarrassed over both her attitude and the loss it cost her. Odilon had initially tried questioning her about it. He himself was disappointed at the sight of her that put her at a disadvantage due to her arrogance, but he couldn't exactly say that he'd never done the same. While he knew he could escape any situation given the time, he also knew it would cost him injuries and may someday even be the end of his life. Once in Gluttony's kingdom, Smell had the half-demon at a loss. She kept spiraling into uncontrollable nausea until she finally found a combination of masking and sense that seemed to reduce it to a tolerable level. She hadn't been so sensitive to smell before, but she really thought nothing of it. She hadn't been in a place this disgusting before either. Odilon had seemed mostly fixed on trying to clear up his own rage within himself. The words of the snake woman had echoed through his mind. Who had she been talking to? He felt the idiot. He couldn't protect them in the times he was meant to. Some nagging voice in his own mind told him that he'd failed to do it again. With Nalia's recklessness, especially when he was threatened, he wondered who would even be to blame if they fell. They both had some work to do, but no time to handle their own mental issues. Their conversation with Gluttony was sending him on a direct path through the great mountains of the ice nearby. In that place, they were told they would encounter many dangerous obstacles. The demon lords suggested they seek the place where the mountains of ice were capped by a giant crystal. It is said to contain the remains of an elder god. The immortals seemed to have no change of expression, but the half-demons certainly did. After all, elders didn't leave remains. This god would have to be sleeping, unconscious, or caught in a recovery cycle. She wasn't even certain how she knew this, but she mentioned it to Odilon. To the mortal, none of that mattered. He demanded to know where to find greed. He wanted an end to all of this. The demon lord smiled and then leaned forward. Everything has a price, human. The future, the past, the truth. But if you're willing to give her blood, I may be able to make a deal. Odilon refused quickly, though Nalia was questioning if such a small thing was even worth the debate. She had shed plenty of blood over the century of her life. It was the way Gluttony was looking at her when he said those words that made her pause. Why is he so eager? What was so special about her blood that he turned away from the mortal, that he would offer this information in the first place? In the end, both refused him, but for whatever reason he told them that near the ice tower is a portal to the Citadel of Sins. There was a place within you could summon each incarnate to their throne, and they must respond. Gluttony looked at Odilon again. The next time I will be less generous, but if you kill the angel corrupting my mountains, I will consider this payment in advance. For whatever reason, he glanced at Nalia with an oddly curious smirk, before stretching his arms out and glancing around. My beast's hunger. Leave before they kill you both. It was a simple statement, but not an untrue one. He would not spare them. They'd not paid him while in his lands. The two ended up fighting dozens of demons before leaving the city. They traversed into less and less populated regions as they moved across towards the ice-capped mountains in the far distance. They even eventually stumbled upon a village with living people within it, far enough from the main part of Gluttony's realms. These ones were mere farmers who offered tribute in exchange for their lives. This was the perfect place to rest and restock. While the two people traveling together seemed a bit of a novelty to the locals, what was more interesting was one of the younger demons calling Nalia a half-angel. It seemed to confuse the girl quite a bit, but she dismissed it, saying it wasn't the first time someone thought that, but she'd been a half-demon and a witch her entire life. Odilon was mostly tired of these exchanges, but seeing her come back to life was something he had to admit was helping him rebuild his drive to finish off their enemies, so that maybe their world and the two of them could have some peace. Just for one lifetime. He wasn't going to hold his breath. Something about the sword and armor he now wore told him that there was going to be a reason they needed to be prepared for battle. When they did reach the summit, they found a path that had been closed off by an avalanche. The two were forced to travel through a cave formed entirely of ice. It was almost a maze, narrow passages, steep drops, slick floors. By the end of the cave system, they found themselves in a stone cavern, facing back out towards the slope. From this location, the pair could easily see a nearby peak, one that had maybe a few days to reach from here. The peak was capped with ice and a giant crystal. It seemed to shimmer from time to time with a blue glow, perhaps even from some light within. The two stopped in the cave to discuss the stories about an elder god having been hidden there. It was at that moment Odilon sensed something, a lingering burning on his chest and neck, a force that was driving pain back into his body again. Almost instinctively, he reached his hands towards his sword as a group of ghost soldiers began to step out of the ice nearby. Nalia suddenly found herself dizzy, a problem she'd had off and on since the awakening. The young demon took a step back before placing her own hand onto the wall of ice. Odilon already had his blade drawn. It wasn't long before he began cutting down the ghosts one after another. These were well-trained warriors. They took turns trying to play him off against the others in a group to distract him. The mortal managed to kick two of them to the same direction, and then slowly began to force each one at a time, back on the same side of him. Being surrounded even by ghosts was not a way he wanted to spend this fight. Nalia, on the other hand, had found her hand gripped tightly by another emerging from the ice. The man who stepped out kept hold of her hand tightly, watching her closely as he emerged from the frozen wall. His glare was cold, his hair white as the snow on the mountain outside. His eyes were exactly like hers. The woman turned to look at him, and he had already drawn his sword, at first only knowing there was a demon here and that he was meant to kill it. But instead, the ghost commanders paused, staring down the woman he was holding on to. He was tall, quite a bit taller than the woman, and barely able to stand in the room. He dragged her aside a moment, pulling her closer to the entrance to get better light to look at her properly, before demanding that she turn towards him. To this point, she'd not really fought back, but as he lowered his blade towards her throat and demanded she look up at him, a strange grin came over her. Odilon was repeatedly cutting down his soldiers with very little gain. She was not going to continue to be weak anymore. She took her blade, drawing it quickly and smashing it into the man's blade. It cut lightly across her chin as he tried to pull it away from her. He released his grip on her hand and now stepped back before laughing at the lady across from him. He began to speak, only to find both Nalia and Odilon attacking him together. It was almost uncanny, the way they seemed to form together in a joint strike without a word. Neither one knew why they'd taken this approach. The man before them spun, a second blade forming in his hand. As the four blades met in the middle, his blades rested outside of theirs, but Nalia's second blade was incoming. She spun it forward, tearing into his side and leg. The man finally smiled and then called off his soldiers suddenly before demanding the two talk with him. Much like Nalia, he traced his fingers along a white horn, an odd sight for an angel. They were the same as hers, only hers were black. The man seemed to have the same nervous habit of fidgeting with a ring that had been placed to decorate his own horns. The fact that he called off the attack convinced the two to give him a very short time. He explained that he hadn't realized that he had a child, that his wife had been declared dead in the raids. He was one of the high lords of a very secretive, seraphic sect. It had taken time. The corruption of her had hidden his own blood fairly well, but he could sense where the corruption was chipping away from her being. He declared that he would find her in even more danger now, being still with child and no longer a demon in this realm. Nalia blinked a few times. The child had been killed. Him saying otherwise mixed hope with a rage that was boiling inside of her now. She began to draw her blade again when he shook his head. He told her that she would know soon one way or the other, and then shrugged before looking back at the human. We are trapped here, unable to live, unable to die, but you could cure us of our misery, maybe forever. Odilon knew he could unmake the souls, but why would any creature truly wish that upon themselves? The man claimed they had tried all other ways of dying, but could neither leave the cave nor move forward in life. Nalia was the one who proposed a different solution. They would kill whoever had trapped them. If it did not free their souls, then they would come back and remove them. The angel leader smiled and told her that she would have to learn to embrace all of her power, light and dark, to conquer what they were about to face. He told her that they were placed into this trap by the current general of the Shadowkind armies. Odilon had apparently not let sink in what he had heard earlier, and then it hit him. He said that she was still carrying their child, but that had to be a mistake. If she was, he did not want her to continue on this adventure. He needed her somewhere safer. The angel explained that they would be found either way. They had very little time and too much to do to worry about moving anyone to safety. The group talked a while longer before the pair traveled on. Odilon was possibly more determined than Nalia to find a way to protect this child. They had been pregnant with twins, but only this one had survived. In fact, this seraph told him that he suspected someone else learned about it before they did. Of course, the serpent woman had to have known, but her not telling them made Odilon much more angry than he cared to admit. He would have left Nalia in that cabin with her had he known. It took them some time to travel from the cavern to where the gateway to the Citadel of Sins was. The two were more cautious than maybe either should have been. Part of the humans still wanted to just find a safe spot to drop this woman. For all his insistence that he needed no one, he did love her and wanted to protect her as he had promised. A part of him knew he couldn't guarantee that where they were going, If anything, Void's comment about partial incarnation made the man suspect they were both going to die soon anyway, which meant all three of them now, and he resented every part of that fact. When the pair reached the gate for the citadel, they weren't sure what to expect. There was a rough stone wall with a rather ornate archway. The gate itself was just like any of the other archways on the road, aside of being clearly carved and designed better than anything on this isolated path. Grass and a small shrub or two had begun to grow beneath it, despite the surrounding snow. The gate itself was shut down. It seemed the two walking through it did nothing. Nalia had stepped back to examine it when she witnessed something truly unexpected. Odilon began to speak quietly in demonic tongue. This was a feat that was difficult for many non-humans, let alone a mortal she didn't even realize could have known it. As he stood back, he allowed himself to glance over the portal again, before reaching a hand to a small raised platform. As he rested his hand over it, a spike suddenly shot upwards, drawing blood from his left hand. It hardly mattered. The new armor allowed him to feel it, but the wound would close itself quickly. In the place of that which had pierced him, a metal spike from the armor filled the hole. A soft clicking sound came from the pedestal, and then the gateway fired to life. Red began flaring through the black as it continued to work again. Nalia wasn't sure what to say, but instead she just smiled for a moment. It seems you're full of surprises. She was proud. After all, most mortals would never have bothered to learn it at all. When they stepped through the portal, the contrast in temperature was the first thing to hit them both. Where there had been a frigid cold, now there was a searing heat that seemed to almost steal the breath from their lungs. In the same moment, a black-haired man within the citadel stirred from where he'd been set to meditate. He was a new king. Only recently he and one other had taken the previous kings within the lands of demons. Not just lords, they reigned supreme within the councils of the dark realms. The man glanced at the darkness surrounding him for a moment. It was close enough to time that he could wait to leave the chamber. He was all too certain the two would be here soon, so he pulled his mask down over his face. He knew that these two strangers were important, too important to leave unaddressed. Still, the law stated he must spend a few more hours in this chamber. What strange timing that they should come now. Still, he knew he had just enough time before they found any real danger. Nalia and Odilon noticed quickly that the area they were looking towards lay barren. The two turned, facing the other direction on the path. There it was. Before them was the Citadel of Sins itself. Like a dark spire had grown out of the lava on the mountains. All it needed was an unexpected visit. Some annoyance struck Odilon. It was said this portal went directly to the Citadel. What neither of them were aware of is that the meditation chamber was active, which meant no teleportation could occur to the building itself. The man who sensed them was exactly the reason they had not been allowed to enter. The two made their way to the Citadel. When asked why they had come, Nalia spoke up, saying they were there to seek the guidance of the Sins and speak with the kings. Odilon allowed it, as the answer seemed to get the guards to put down their weapons for now. Still, this guard did not let them pass. Not right away. He demanded they identify themselves and exactly who and what they wished to see. Most went straight to the lands of the Sin themselves, not the Citadel, for their answer. Humans don't follow the laws of the demon realms. The woman said it so quickly that the man actually paused. A moment later, he laughed. Human. You? Did you think your pet had any say in what happens here? The woman simply smiled before taking a single step closer to the guard. Not my pet. My husband. And if you do not respect him, you can join the dead we left in our wake. The man stared at her a moment, and then back to the mortal. He understood then. He had heard the stories of those they'd killed. He'd seen the damage to one of their own shadow kind at the hands of the human and the half-demon. These stories were everywhere. If greed will not answer, we'll speak with the kings. Odilon had really not tried to hide the threat that was in those words. If anything, he wanted them to know exactly what he meant to do. If he could not speak reason, he would speak death. At the moment, he really preferred being their deaths. The guards started to refuse when an all-too-familiar face appeared directly behind him. The immortal had a strangely sadistic grin, not too strange for himself, but he had changed quite a bit since they last saw him. Delaki was wearing a series of metal bands that circled his chest. Each one was bound tightly to bolts that had been drilled and attached to the ribs on the opposite side. Deep metal staples and ties seemed to bind together the broken parts of his body. The demon had not ever recovered from the previous battle. In fact, if he moved wrong, the wounds would still bleed. He'd found a way some time ago to stop the bleeding most of the time. These two walking into his own home, he wasn't sure what to make of it. It wasn't as if he hadn't been told they were coming. He just really didn't believe that they would make it this far. The human began to draw his sword. Delaki waved his hand dismissively, his focus still mostly on the other guard. Let them through. I'll make sure they're well taken care of. He motioned towards Odilon a moment and then spoke again. Put the blade away. You won't need it before the Grand Gardens, and I won't be fighting you today. The change in his behavior was almost enough to leave both parties confused about what was happening. He normally was more brash and by far more interested in a fight. He seemed to have toned down some, or just didn't want to drag the younger guard into this matter. He still refused to answer any questions to the demon or the swordsman and his companion. Rather, he began to lead the two through the bridges that rested upon the still cooling lava fields. He knew he could have fought them here, but his master's words were still echoing in his head. Once they reached the building itself, he walked them past the first gate. Only a short distance behind it was a group of elite guard, all of them in full armor, each with their weapons drawn and standing to wait. Greed is not here, but the new king has asked us to set a challenge. Defeat these, and he will answer your questions. Delaki stepped back with a half-bow, but as he spoke again, he was hoping Odilon would be the only one to hear his words. Do try not to embarrass me again. He meant the defeat he had suffered. If the mortal did poorly here, it would only make his own situation worse. Nalia stepped back slightly. She was wanting to fight, but having heard that she still carried one of their children within her left her suddenly aware of the danger to the little one. As a guard came in towards Odilon, he began to fight them back away from her. She had drawn her blades and was preparing to fight when Delaki came back up behind her again. If you do not fight, she will die anyway. Do what you must. Protect what you have. It was odd. Delaki sounded almost sad at his own words. She'd never noticed this side of him before. Still, she did take up her weapons. This child needed a safe world if they were going to have it. Delaki had been ordered to stand down from fighting the two of them unless they came at him first, so he stood back to watch the fray. It wasn't long before Nalia had killed two of them, in a time much more permanent manner than she normally allowed. The one that had tried to attack her stomach had set her into a frenzy. She wasn't going to go through this again. She began to cut through the soldiers one by one, elite by elite. Still, even with all her fury, she was nothing compared to what stood beside her. The Shadowkind armies were slowly falling to the pair, the most elite demons of the guard. By the time the battle had finished, the mortal had killed hundreds of them. The half-mortal had easily killed half what he had, Without any hesitation, she would likely have killed more had he not been so efficient about it. One last Shadowkind stepped forward. This one was larger than the others, larger even than Delaki, and easily as strong as the demon had been before his injuries. As general to the Shadowkind elite, he was more than convinced he could have handled this himself had he only been invited to the party. The man had waist-length black hair, braided into a long trail down his back. The sides of his head were shaved clean, tattoos lined his skin where the hair would have been, markings of old battles and great victories mostly. The man's black eyes had settled on the two of them, a human and an angel. It seemed more like a fun day than a battle. He honestly could not have been more wrong. As the pair began to attack him, he pushed Nalia harshly back away from him. He was the first to actually focus on the human in combat in some time. The thought of that made her smile, so she stepped back, letting the immortal have his own fun in the moment. Odilon hated banter, yet he took the moment to ask this Shadowkind about the captive band of angels. Once it had been confirmed that this was the man's doing, he decided they could at least try to fulfill the one goal that had been given to them. And it was a shorter battle than he expected. Still, he had sustained more than a few injuries. Sensing his coming defeat, the Shadowkind general had grabbed the girl, wrapping an arm around her shoulders and pulling her back against him suddenly. He'd meant to use her as a shield to block the mortal from damaging him further. Odilon stopped for a moment and then growled, letting his weapon rest slightly lower in his hands. He was nowhere close to giving up, but to someone who wasn't used to him, it looked like he was considering it. That wouldn't matter soon. Once more, without a word, the two had formed a plan. Nalia suddenly reached both hands up to the arm that held her close to the immortal. A white flame formed around the both of them, burning holy light through the demon and causing his entire arm to catch on fire. It took him no time to throw the girl across the floor, casting her aside while trying to douse the flames on his own body. As soon as the general had thrown Nalia, Odilon rushed forward, driving his blade through the center of the still flailing immortal. These flames began to follow his blood down the blade before finally stopping when the blade took the immortal blood within itself. As soon as the flames died, the general began to split apart, fragments of his body falling away. At the same time, multiple strands of shadows released from his form, like ropes that had held wild beasts at the end of them. Nalia only hoped this meant that the ones they met in the mountains were now free. Delaki waited a moment, then stood up from where he leaned against the wall. The man snapped his fingers to draw their attention. The king of the Shadow Quarter has chosen to address you. The man who stepped forward at this introduction was quite a bit taller than Odilon. His armor was fairly simple, only having a few gold and bronze adornments along fairly standard plate mail. The mask had horns, symbolic of those he often kept hidden. He looked over the both of them from behind his mask before finally choosing to speak. Come. The single word was all he chose to say. He motioned for the two to follow without any further information. He knew exactly what his plans were now. He needed to speak to them, and he needed his servant to be far from the discussion. He allowed Delaki to follow him until the door of the room he'd chosen for their talk. Then he commanded the immortal to wait outside. Despite the protests of the guard, the king simply stared at him until he fell silent. Of course, a king could tend to himself. The human had done severe damage to many of them, but a part of Delaki still wondered if the human could have fought this new king. First, I congratulate you both on helping me to purge the filth of the Shadowkind. We can rebuild them with better warriors. The man motioned for them to sit in a space across from him. Nalia refused at first, but he refused to speak or look away from her until she finally chose to sit quietly next to where Odilon already sat. The human could care less, seated or not. If this immortal intended to fight him, he would learn why he should not be underestimated. The king was continuing to tell them that there were changes coming to these realms, and he offered to answer only a few questions before their time was up. The human wasn't sure if he meant their death or something else, nor did he care. The first question he asked was about greed. The man across from him stood up and began slowly pacing before a trace of blue flames licked at his fingertips. Greed? He's not one you're ready to seek yet. You're not at full power in her. He motioned towards Nalia. He was hoping for 2-in-1 anyway. Both your woman and your daughter. Why do you think? He was silenced by the human nearly instantly. I would kill them myself first. The words made Nalia blink as she looked at the man she loved. She wasn't sure if she should be horrified or impressed at his intention to keep them both safe. She knew what he meant, though. Whatever death gave them, it had to be better than whatever greed could come up with. You may have to, or I will if you prefer. The king simply shrugged. Frankly, you aren't ready for this battle. And if that king weren't so damn optimistic, he would have told you already. His hand swiftly motioned towards the blade. What do you mean? It was Nalia who asked. The human had full trust in the blade. She wasn't fully aware of its nature. The old king. He knows. Man only glanced at Odilon before continuing. He probably thought with everything to lose you would fight to your fullest ability. She's a distraction, yet... He paused, looking Nalia over. You suit each other. While she would live and die to protect you, you would burn the universe to protect her and the ones you swore to fight for. With nothing to lose. Nothing to hold you back. He took a slow breath. There is not much time before the other kings return. Let me explain. Your weaknesses and strengths are exactly why you could win. They're exactly what they'll use to try to force you to lose. The man's pacing stopped suddenly as he turned to face them both. Questions. Nalia growled. I would never allow this. No one will harm him. Her words were louder than normal. The woman stood. No one will harm her now either. She will be gone soon. So will you. You're not whole. How do you intend to fight beings that are as powerful as your whole self in a partial state? It's idiotic. Nalia began to growl. She probably would have rushed the man where he stood if the human hadn't dragged her back to her seat again. Your temper is another thing. The god mused, then actually chuckled at something he knew they did not know. Again, questions. Who is he? Her voice was soft now. She hadn't meant to ask the question out loud. She was already starting to suspect she knew who the king was. It didn't matter. This mortal, though. He's earned the title with the council as the Godslayer, the same as you, young lady, have somehow been called a traitor. Because of your status, though. He paused, then closed his eyes. The red and gold glow behind his mask stopped for a moment, then resumed. You will not learn in this lifetime. The next, though. Stop being cryptic and tell me how to end this. Odilon was sick of it. If they couldn't fight with these bodies, maybe they could get new ones. All he cared was for the fact that this needed to end. As you prefer. The king paused, then looked directly at Nalia. Put a king on the elder throne. Mortal or not, it doesn't matter. They must obey. He then smirked behind his mask before speaking again. A mortal would be amusing. To prove themselves worthy of that seat. He looked at the human. Understand, that one will help you. Wrath holds true to all of his champions. See him if you have trouble. But neither of us are. He paused a moment, trying to recall if he'd even met the Sin before. The king laughed and shook his head. Not yet. No. But you'll see soon enough. With that, the man fell silent and glanced at the corner of the room. One last question. Make it good, mortal. Nalia began to speak, and the Demon King held up his hands towards her. The mortal. You will have to learn soon. You're dying as we speak. The words sent a chill through her. Dying? That was impossible. There were no injuries. She had healed well, and she was carrying a child. During her silent confusion, the human took a moment or two to try to process this. One last question. How do I become worthy of the throne? He hated the idea. He was not meant to be a king, and tired of everyone implying he should be. But if he could put an end to this... The immortal stopped, then walked over closer to the mortal a moment before looking down at him. Stand up. The human stood, still shorter than the man, but looking up at him defiantly as he expected his answer. He stared into the soul of the stranger for a moment and saw something unexpected. Blue. A flash of pure crystalline blue, like the runes of the Elder Sword. It was gone an instant later. The immortal looked the human over. You might be. If you make the right sacrifices at the right time, and stop doubting who and what you are. The sword began to hum, and the immortal laughed before motioning towards it. Oh, the king speaks to me now. He looks back at the mortal again and speaks up. He says that you must listen and obey him. I will tell you that you must listen and obey yourself. Do not let anyone choose your path for you unless you're completely certain they have the right goals in mind. The demon felt his energy begin to drain, and he stepped back slightly from the mortal with the sword. He was a great king and a good man. He chose you because you are very much the same, but do not let his limits influence yours. The Demon King motioned to the door. Delaki is outside. We can send you to the mortal realms, or you can die here at your own choice. All remains will be destroyed. If you want to continue this fight, you both have to die here. Nalia was angry. She still wanted to fight. She walked towards the tall immortal and stared defiantly up at him. Let me die fighting, then. It was her own arrogance, or maybe her own insecurity. She'd fought her entire life. She wanted to fight for her death. No, not this time, princess. You are already reborn. The child will be returned to the void, and you both will return to your new bodies. Wrath will help you if you're not forced to forget your alliance with him. He served the elders in the past as well. He looked over Nalia a moment. Peace or war, child? You barely missed connecting with yourself on the road here. She was in the lands of gluttony only days before you. She's seeking her own power. Do you choose to end peacefully or not? Nalia looked at Odilon, then closed her eyes. I choose to have the power to end this. The man nodded, and then glanced at Odilon. A new body and a new start. This year's if you agree, or you can keep fighting and find her later. Odilon looked at Nalia. He knew it didn't matter now. If they could not win, he could not protect her. But if she was alive, she could protect herself. Some part of him knew that. Both. Let me have that new body and let me continue my fight. Done. The last thing either remembered was a burning flash of blue light that filled the room. The sword did not attempt to stop it. The armor agreed. His consent allowed his death. As the light faded, Deleki finally stepped into the room. Are we done? The immortal nodded. Take the armor to the woman at the gates of void. I will bring the sword to where it will be most useful. The king reached his hand out, pulling the sword from the ground with ease. Forgive me, old friend. I'm afraid you'll be stuck with my company for a time. Deleki shook his head. What next, King Asmodeus? The immortal removed his mask and then smiled at the new general of the Shadowkind. To the arenas. I do believe it's time that you proved yourself. With that, the man placed his mask back on and walked through a portal with the sword. The room lay empty, the spell of the meditation chamber broken, unknown to all who had stood within it. Unexpected by the gods themselves, the death of these two sacrifices destabilized the awakening. The portals closed, and the beasts were forced out of the chambers where they waited to travel to the mortal plane. The ceremony would have to be restored. A sacrifice large enough to reopen the gates had to be made, and now they would have to seek one. The few immortals still alive in the city of Trist began to gather together, deciding to form a new army to restore the order and bring back as many of their kind as possible. First, though, they needed to relocate their gods. In the far distant lands, a young elf with red hair and golden eyes woke from a terrible nightmare. She was still confused at what happened to her. It was only a dream, but she felt an emptiness within her she couldn't explain. She growled, picking up the large sword she had found during her travels, and began using it to practice, hoping to clear her mind. In the further distance of the lands of mortals, a small white-haired boy looked at the man who was screaming at him. He looked at the others around him. He was certain of only one thing. Whatever was happening here was wrong, and he was going to put a stop to it someday. The two new incarnations were about to find the power they never knew they had.